Somewhere right now, someone is being manipulated and they have no idea. They think they made a choice. They think the idea was theirs. They think they fell in love, changed their mind, took the job, trusted the stranger, all on their own. They did not. Someone else planted the seed, watered it in silence, and stepped back to watch it grow, taking care never to be seen holding the watering can. This is the oldest game in human history. Long before written language, before law, before money, there was influence. The invisible art of moving another person's will without them feeling the hand that moved it. Kings fell to it. Empires were built on it. And the people who mastered it were never the loudest in the room. They were the ones who said almost nothing, and yet somehow everyone did exactly what they wanted. You have been taught that honesty and hard work are enough, that transparency wins trust, that people respond to logic, to fairness, to good intentions clearly stated. This is a comforting lie, and it is the reason so many talented, decent people spend their lives being outmaneuvered by men and women far less capable than them, but far more fluent in the darker language beneath words, the language of desire, insecurity, ego, and fear. Today I am going to teach you that language, not so you become a monster, but because the moment you understand how influence truly works, you become impossible to manipulate, and when necessary, dangerous to underestimate. By the end of this, you will never watch a conversation, a negotiation, a seduction, or a betrayal the same way again. You will see the strings, and once you see them, you will never again mistake yourself for a puppet. The first law of influence is this: no one shows you who they are. They show you who they have decided you should believe they are. From the moment we are children, we learn that the raw self, our jealousy, our fear, our hunger for status, our contempt, must be hidden if we wish to be loved, hired, trusted, followed. So we construct a mask, a pleasant face, a reasonable tone, a story about our motives that flatters us. We wear this mask so consistently for so many years that eventually we forget it is a mask at all. We come to believe it is our face. This is the first mistake almost everyone makes when trying to understand or influence other people. They take the mask at face value. They listen to what a person says about themselves and record it as fact. A colleague says he only wants what's best for the team, and you believe him because why would he lie? A new acquaintance says she doesn't care about money, and you take her at her word because it would be rude not to. This is how the unprepared mind operates. It accepts the story it is told because questioning it feels almost immoral, like an accusation. But here is what centuries of court intrigue, boardroom warfare, and human history teach us again and again. Words are the cheapest currency in existence. Anyone can produce them in unlimited supply, and they cost the speaker nothing. What a person says about their own motives should be given almost no weight at all. What matters, the only thing that ever truly matters, is what they do when they believe no one of consequence is watching, and what they consistently gain from the positions they take. Study the pattern of a person's actions over the pattern of their explanations, and an entirely different portrait emerges, often the exact opposite of the one they present. The executive who speaks endlessly of servant leadership but never once declines a bonus while cutting his team's budget. The friend who insists she is just being honest but only ever offers her brutal honesty to people she secretly envies. The politician who campaigns as an outsider then surrounds himself within weeks with the very insiders he claimed to despise. None of these people are lying, exactly. They may even believe their own mask. That is what makes it dangerous. The most effective masks are worn by people who have persuaded themselves first. To move through the world with real power, you must develop what I call the second sight, the habit of watching behavior as if it were the only language that mattered, because in the deepest sense it is. Ask yourself of everyone around you, what do they consistently protect? What do they flinch at? What subject changes the temperature of their voice? These small, involuntary signals betray more truth in 3 seconds than a person's entire rehearsed biography. And once you understand that everyone is performing a mask, a second, more unsettling realization follows. Influence is not the act of telling people the truth and hoping they respond to it. Influence is the art of speaking to the mask in a language it wants to hear, while quietly addressing the real hidden self underneath, the one hungry for validation, terrified of irrelevance, desperate to be seen as the exception, the hero, the one who was right all along. This is why moralizing, lecturing, and appeals to pure logic so rarely change anyone's mind. You are arguing with the mask. The mask does not care about your facts. The mask's entire function is self-protection. But the self beneath the mask, the insecure animal that fears exposure and craves status, that self is listening for something else entirely. It is listening for permission. Permission to change its mind without losing face. Permission to feel intelligent, chosen, superior, safe. The most dangerous people in history, and I mean this as a technical description, not a moral judgment, were the ones who learned to stop arguing with masks and started speaking directly to what lay beneath them. Cardinal Richelieu did not defeat his rivals in the court of Louis XIII by out-arguing them. He studied their vanities, their debts, their private terrors, and constructed situations in which their own hidden selves did his work for him. He rarely needed to persuade anyone of anything. He simply arranged reality so that people persuaded themselves and believed until the very end that the decision had been entirely their own. This is the essence of the mask and the beginning of real power. Understand that you are never speaking to one person, but to two, the performer and the frightened animal wearing the performer as a costume. Master the ability to see both at once in every room you enter, and an entire hidden layer of human interaction opens itself to you, one that most people will go their whole lives without ever perceiving. They will call you intuitive, they will call you unsettling. What they will actually mean is that you have simply learned to look. Here is a truth that offends the modern ear. Strength does not seduce. Weakness does. We are raised on stories that tell us the opposite, that confidence attracts, that competence wins loyalty, that showing your full power is the surest path to respect. This is only half true, and the half that is missing is the half that separates those who merely impress from those who truly influence. Total uninterrupted strength creates distance. It creates admiration, perhaps envy, sometimes fear, but rarely intimacy, and never the particular loyalty that comes from a person feeling needed. Human beings do not fall under the spell of the invincible. They fall under the spell of the almost invincible, the powerful figure who reveals at precisely the right moment a flash of vulnerability, a brief admission of doubt. A moment where they seem, for just a second, human, breakable, in need of you specifically. This single flash does more to bind a person to you than 100 displays of competence, because it flatters them in the deepest way possible. It tells them they have been given access no one else has. It tells them they matter enough to be trusted with the truth behind the mask. Study the great seducers of history, not merely in romance, but in politics, in business, in war, and you find this pattern without exception. Napoleon, in his private letters to Josephine, did not present himself as the unstoppable conqueror Europe already knew. He wrote as a man consumed, undone, tormented by longing, a general who could command armies but apparently could not command his own heart. This vulnerability was not weakness. It was a precisely engineered lure. It made the most powerful man on the continent feel, to one woman, entirely hers. This same principle governs influence far beyond the bedroom. The leader who occasionally lets a trusted subordinate glimpse a private doubt creates a devotion that pure command never could, because that subordinate now believes they alone see behind the curtain. The negotiator who admits, seemingly against his own interest, to a small weakness in his position often extracts far better terms than the one who postures as flawless, because the admission disarms suspicion and manufactures trust, exactly where trust is most useful to him. But understand the danger hidden inside this law, because it cuts in both directions, and most people only ever learn to wield the blade that faces away from them. If revealed vulnerability creates devotion in others, It means that everyone who has ever appeared vulnerable to you, the colleague who confided in you, the partner who seemed to open up so quickly, the stranger who trusted you with their secret within the hour of meeting you, may have been doing precisely this. Deliberately or instinctively, they have been offering you a controlled wound, knowing that the moment you feel needed, you stop asking whether you are being led. This is the seduction of weakness in its purest, most dangerous form. It does not always announce itself as manipulation, because often the person deploying it does not consciously know they are doing it. Some of the most effective manipulators in history were not cynics coldly calculating vulnerability for effect. They were people who had learned through years of getting exactly what they wanted, that appearing fragile was simply how the world responded to them. And they never had to think about it again. It became instinct, and instinct is far more convincing than performance. So how does one defend against this, and how does one wield it without losing themselves entirely? The defense is simple to state and difficult to practice. Whenever you feel a sudden surge of protective tenderness towards someone whose power over you should, by every rational measure, make you cautious rather than sympathetic, stop. Ask what that vulnerability is costing them and what it is buying them. Genuine weakness is inconvenient, ongoing, and rarely displayed to strategic advantage. Manufactured weakness, the kind used as a tool of influence, arrives with impeccable timing. It appears exactly when your guard was rising and vanishes the moment its purpose is served. The offense, meanwhile, requires more discipline than most are willing to exercise because it demands the very opposite of what feels natural to the ambitious. It requires that you resist the urge to constantly prove your strength. Restraint is the seducer's true weapon. Say less about your triumphs than you could. Let others discover your capability rather than announcing it. And then at the one moment it will do the most work. When trust must be deepened, when a rival must be disarmed, when a follower must be transformed into a believer, reveal a single carefully chosen crack in the armor, not too much. Never more than a glimpse. The moment vulnerability becomes constant, it stops being seductive and becomes simply weak. And weakness without strategy invites exploitation rather than devotion. The art lies entirely in the ratio. 95% command, 5% confession. That 5% deployed at the correct instant will do more to bind another human being to your will than any argument, any threat, or any promise ever could. They will not remember what you said. They will remember the moment they believed they alone had been let in. And long after the moment has passed, they will still be trying to get back in that room. Every human being is broadcasting at all times on a frequency they do not know they are transmitting on. Words are chosen, sentences are rehearsed. But the body, the eyes, the timing of a pause, the sudden change in someone's questions, these things leak the truth constantly, and almost no one is trained to listen. This is the third discipline of influence. The ability to read what a person cannot help but reveal, because it operates beneath the level of conscious control. Master this, and you gain a permanent advantage over everyone who still believes conversation is primarily about content. Consider the pause. In ordinary speech, we assume pauses are simply the natural rhythm of thought. But watch closely. Over years, and a pattern emerges. People pause longest exactly where the truth is most inconvenient to them. Ask a colleague a direct question about a decision that benefited them at someone else's expense, and notice the fractional delay before the smooth, well-constructed answer arrives. That delay is not thoughtfulness. It is the mind's frantic search for the version of the truth that will play best. And the search itself takes time. The honest answer never needs. Consider also the over-answer. When people are asked something they have nothing to hide about, their answers tend to be short, almost bored, because the truth requires no defense. But when a question brushes against something they are protecting, watch how the answer swells. Additional justification nobody asked for, unprompted evidence of good intent, a story that arrives fully formed and slightly too polished. Innocence rarely explains itself at length. Only the guarded mind feels the need to argue a case no one has yet accused it of losing. Then there is the mirror of discomfort, the subject a person cannot help returning to, disguised as casual conversation, when in fact it is the very thing consuming them. Listen for what people bring up unprompted, again and again, in different contexts, as though testing whether you have noticed. The executive who repeatedly, almost compulsively, mentions how little he cares what others think of him is very often the man who thinks of nothing else. This is not universal, but it is common enough and consistent enough to be one of the sharper tools in the art of reading people. What a person insists upon unprompted is frequently a confession wearing the disguise of a boast. Silence itself carries information most people are too impatient to collect. In any negotiation, in any confrontation, the untrained mind rushes to fill silence, believing that dead air is a failure to be corrected. But silence is a pressure test. Offer a proposal and then say nothing at all, and watch what the other person does with the space you have refused to fill. The anxious will rush to justify themselves before you have even objected. The confident will simply wait, matching your stillness with their own. In this single exchange, before a single further word is spoken, you have already learned more about their position than an hour of direct questioning would have revealed. The eyes, contrary to popular belief, are one of the least reliable signals of deception. Too many people have learned to consciously control their gaze, precisely because they have been taught, wrongly, that eye contact reveals lies. This is why so many amateur lie detectors are so easily fooled. They watch the one channel everyone already knows to police. The disciplined observer watches instead the hands, which people almost never think to manage, hands that still suddenly, that grip an object more tightly, that withdraw slightly from the table the moment a subject turns dangerous. The body has not yet learned to lie as fluently as the mouth has. But the deepest signal of all, the one that took me years of study to fully appreciate, is timing relative to self-interest. Watch not what a person says, but the precise moment they choose to say it. The colleague who suddenly discovers a principled objection to your plan only after learning it will not include him in the credit. The friend whose enthusiasm for your success cools by a matching degree to how much your success outpaces her own. This is not necessarily cynicism on their part. Often they believe entirely in the principled objection, entirely in their own goodwill. But timing does not lie. Even when the person attached to it sincerely believes their own performance, the signal is not in what they claim to feel. It is in the coincidence between their feelings and their interest, a coincidence that occurs far too often to be an accident in nearly everyone, including, if you are honest with yourself, in you. This is the final and most uncomfortable use of this entire discipline. Turn it inward, the same delay in your own speech when asked an inconvenient question, the same unprompted justification, the same conveniently timed principle. If you learn to read these signals only in others, you will become a formidable manipulator of them, but a stranger to yourself. And self-blindness of that kind eventually becomes the very weakness that someone sharper than you will learn to read. The goal is not merely to see through others. It is to become, at last, someone who can no longer be so easily seen through. Certainty is a gift you give away for free, and once given, it can never be taken back. The moment you state exactly what you want, exactly what you believe, exactly where you stand, you have handed every person in the room a fixed target. They now know precisely how to please you, precisely how to oppose you, precisely how to use you. Clarity, so often praised as a virtue, is in truth one of the most disarming acts a person in a position of influence can commit, because it converts an unpredictable force into a manageable one. This is why the figures history remembers as masters of influence rarely announce their intentions plainly. Talleyrand, who served and outlasted nearly every regime in France across 4 decades of revolution, terror, empire, and restoration, was famous for a diplomatic style built almost entirely on studied ambiguity. He rarely said what he meant, and when he did speak plainly, it was so rare that his listeners assumed it must carry extraordinary weight, when in fact the plain statement was often the most calculated deception of all, precisely because everyone had learned to expect obscurity from him. He understood something almost no one around him did. The person whose position cannot be fully read cannot be fully countered. Ambiguity, properly used, is not confusion. Confusion is simply incompetence dressed up as mystery, and people can smell the difference instantly. True strategic ambiguity is precision aimed at concealment. You know exactly what you want. You simply decline to reveal the full shape of it, offering instead fragments, signals, and positions flexible enough to be reinterpreted as circumstances shift. Consider how this plays out in negotiation. The amateur enters a negotiation with a number in mind and states it early, believing transparency will be rewarded with reciprocal honesty. It rarely is. It is instead recorded, filed, and used as the ceiling from which all further concessions will be extracted. The master negotiator, by contrast, allows their position to remain fluid for as long as possible, responding to offers with questions rather than counter numbers, forcing the other side to reveal the shape of their own desire before committing to the shape of his own. By the time he finally states a position, he is no longer guessing at what the room will accept. He already knows, because the room has told him everything, while believing it was him doing the revealing. This same law governs the management of loyalty and rivalry within any organization. The leader who publicly and permanently declares a single favorite, a single heir, a single trusted lieutenant has just extinguished the competitive energy of everyone else in the room. Why would the overlooked continue exerting themselves for a prize they now know they cannot win? But the leader who maintains careful, deliberate ambiguity about succession, about favor, about who truly holds their trust, keeps every talented person beneath them straining for a prize that might still plausibly be theirs. This is not cruelty for its own sake, though it can curdle into that in lesser hands. Properly used, it is simply the recognition that certainty relaxes effort, and ambiguity sustains it. There is a darker application of this same principle, one that deserves to be named plainly rather than romanticized. Ambiguity as a shield against consequence. The public figure who speaks in a manner vague enough to be read multiple ways by multiple audiences is not being cowardly. Whatever his critics claim, he is protecting his ability to pivot without ever being caught in outright contradiction. Words that were never fully committed to one meaning cannot later be proven false. This is precisely why so much of the language used by those who hold real power sounds, to an untrained ear, almost meaningless, full of qualifiers, careful of absolutes, endlessly reversible. It is not meaningless. It is engineered. Every escape hatch was built in on purpose, long before it was ever needed. But strategic ambiguity carries real risk, and the undisciplined mistake vagueness for strength when it is deployed without a clear internal compass. The danger is that ambiguity used constantly, without an anchor of genuine conviction beneath it, eventually reads not as mystery but as emptiness, and people do not follow, trust, or fear what they believe to be hollow. The masters of this discipline were never actually uncertain internally. Talleyrand always knew exactly what he wanted. He simply refused to let anyone else know it before it served him for them to know. The ambiguity was theater, performed over an absolute and unwavering private clarity. This, then, is the discipline to cultivate. Know precisely, privately, unshakably what you want, and reveal it to the world only in fragments, at the moment of maximum advantage, in a form flexible enough to be denied, reshaped, or redirected the instant circumstances change. Let others rush to fill the silence you leave around your true position with their own guesses, their own hopes, their own fears, and let those guesses do the work that a direct statement never could. The world will call you unpredictable. What they will mean without realizing it is that they have lost the ability to finish your sentences, and there is no more valuable form of power than that. The instinct, when confronted with an enemy, is to destroy them, avoid them, or defeat them so thoroughly that they cease to matter. This instinct, however satisfying, is almost always a waste of the single most valuable resource an enemy provides: information, energy, and leverage that no ally could ever offer you. An enemy watches you more closely than any friend ever will. Friends grow comfortable, complacent, distracted by their own affairs. Enemies do not. They study your patterns, your weaknesses, your habits, because their own position depends on understanding you better than you understand yourself. This means an enemy, without ever intending it, becomes one of the most rigorous auditors of your character and strategy that you will ever have access to, if you are disciplined enough to make use of what their hostility reveals, rather than simply resenting the fact of it. The first and most difficult skill in this discipline is learning to read criticism from an enemy as data rather than injury. When a rival attacks your competence, your ethics, your character, the untrained mind experiences only the sting and responds with denial or retaliation. The trained mind asks a colder, more useful question: what does this attack reveal about where I am actually vulnerable? An enemy rarely wastes their sharpest weapon on a target that isn't real. Even exaggerated, even malicious criticism usually contains, buried inside the exaggeration, a genuine fracture worth examining. Your friends, out of kindness, will rarely tell you where that fracture lies. Your enemies, out of hostility, will announce it to everyone who will listen, and in doing so, hand you a map to your own weaknesses that you could not have drawn yourself. The second skill is more advanced still, and this is where true influence separates itself from mere self-defense. The ability to convert an enemy's hostility into a resource that serves your own position, without their consent and often without their awareness. History is filled with figures who understood that a visible enemy, properly managed, is often more useful than an invisible one, because a known adversary gives you something a world of universal approval never can: a foil. A common threat unites your allies more effectively than any shared goal you could invent on your own. Leaders in every era have quietly benefited from the existence of a rival fierce enough to keep their own followers loyal out of necessity, afraid of what might happen should that rival win instead. There is a further, colder application still, one that the truly ruthless understood long before it had a name in any modern text. The enemy who is destroyed too completely leaves a vacuum, and vacuums are unpredictable, filled by whoever moves fastest, not by whoever deserves the space. The enemy who is instead managed, contained, occasionally even quietly assisted at moments of maximum weakness on your part, remains a known and calculable quantity, weakened enough to pose no true threat, but present enough to continue serving the strategic functions their hostility provides. This is precisely why so many rivalries in politics, business, and even families persist for decades without ever reaching a final resolution. Total victory is not always the goal. Sustainable advantage sometimes is, and total victory can be, paradoxically, its enemy. Consider, too, the particular usefulness of an enemy's predictability. Once you have studied a rival closely enough, their hostility becomes a lever you can pull almost at will. Provoke them in a controlled, deliberate manner, at a time and in a context of your choosing, and their reliable response. The outburst, the overreach, the public misstep their anger tends to produce becomes evidence you did not have to manufacture yourself, delivered by their own hand, in front of an audience that will trust it precisely because it appears unprompted. This is among the darkest and most effective techniques in the entire discipline of influence. Engineering the conditions under which your enemy incriminates themselves, while your own hands remain, to every outside observer, entirely clean. None of this requires personal hatred, and the most effective practitioners of this discipline rarely feel any. Hatred clouds judgment. It makes strategy personal, and personal strategy is undisciplined strategy. The colder, more useful posture is a kind of professional respect for the enemy's function in your life, treating them not as a moral failing to be condemned, but as a structural feature of your position to be managed, studied, and, where possible, quietly harvested for advantage. This is uncomfortable to hear, because we are raised to believe enemies are simply obstacles and that a well-lived life eliminates them as quickly as possible. But eliminate every enemy completely.